The forgotten Waverly family of the Appalachians, what they revealed in 1964, shocked America. In the cold morning of March 17, 1964, social worker Margaret Hensley drove her worn-out Chevrolet through the winding dirt roads of McDowell County, West Virginia, completely unaware that she was about to uncover one of the most disturbing cases of familial isolation in American history. The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly around her, their peaks still dusted with late winter snow, creating an atmosphere of profound desolation that seemed to warn visitors away. Margaret had been assigned to investigate reports from a traveling Baptist minister who claimed to have encountered a family living in conditions he described as beyond human comprehension in a remote hollow approximately 40 miles from the nearest town. The minister, Reverend Thomas Crawford, had stumbled upon the Waverly homestead while searching for isolated families to bring into his congregation. What he witnessed there left him so disturbed that he immediately contacted the McDowell County Department of Social Services, insisting that immediate intervention was necessary. The road became increasingly treacherous as Margaret ventured deeper into the wilderness. Bare oak and hickory trees lined the narrow path, their twisted branches creating skeletal shadows across the muddy trail. The isolation was palpable. She hadn't seen another human dwelling for over an hour. Finally, after navigating a particularly steep incline, she arrived at a clearing where a collection of dilapidated structures stood in various states of collapse. The main dwelling was a two-story wooden house that appeared to have been constructed sometime in the late 1800s, its weathered planks gray with age and neglect. Several smaller outbuildings surrounded it, including what looked like a former barn and a few shed-like structures that seemed to serve as additional living quarters. The entire property was surrounded by dense forest, creating a natural barrier that had kept the Waverly family hidden from the outside world for generations. As Margaret stepped out of her vehicle, an overwhelming stench hit her immediately, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting wood, animal waste, and something else she couldn't quite identify, but that made her stomach turn. The March air was cold and damp, carrying with it the musty smell of decay that seemed to permeate everything in the hollow. Before she could approach the main house, several figures emerged from the shadows. Margaret's professional training had prepared her for many difficult situations, but nothing could have readied her for what she saw that day. The first person to appear was a woman who Margaret later learned was named Sarah Waverly, approximately 35 years old but looking decades older. Sarah's face showed pronounced asymmetry, with her left eye positioned significantly lower than her right, and her jaw jutted forward in a severe underbite that made speaking clearly nearly impossible. She moved with a shuffling gait, her spine curved in an unnatural angle that suggested severe skeletal abnormalities. Behind Sarah came 3 children, if they could still be called children given their ages ranged from 15 to 21. Each displayed physical characteristics that immediately signaled something profoundly wrong. The eldest, a young man named Jeremiah, had a skull that appeared elongated and misshapen, with a pronounced sloping forehead and ears set unusually low on his head. His arms hung at different lengths, and his fingers were fused together in a way that made simple tasks nearly impossible. The middle child, a girl named Ruth, exhibited similar facial asymmetry to her mother, but more severe. Her eyes wandered independently of each other, and her speech consisted only of guttural sounds that her family seemed to understand but Margaret could not decipher. The youngest, a boy called Abel, walked on legs that bowed outward so severely that each step appeared painful. His hands trembled constantly, and his head bobbed involuntarily with a rhythmic motion that never ceased. As Margaret stood frozen, taking in the scene before her, an elderly man emerged from the main house. This was Ezekiel Waverly, the family patriarch, then 73 years old. Unlike his children and grandchildren, Ezekiel showed fewer obvious physical deformities, though his gait was unsteady and his speech slurred. His eyes, however, held a sharpness that suggested a mind still functioning, still aware, still maintaining control over this isolated kingdom he had created in the hollow. "State your business," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying an accent that seemed to belong to a much earlier era of Appalachian speech, almost Elizabethan in its cadence. "We don't take kindly to strangers in this hollow." Margaret introduced herself, explaining that she was there to ensure the family's welfare and to offer assistance if needed. Ezekiel's expression remained unchanged, a mixture of suspicion and something else, perhaps defiance or maybe resignation that his family's isolation was finally ending. "We've been taking care of ourselves just fine for near about 100 years, Ezekiel responded. "Don't need no government folk poking around in our business." But Margaret had legal authority to investigate, and despite Ezekiel's protests, she insisted on documenting the living conditions. What she discovered over the next several hours would form the basis of a case file that would eventually make its way to the highest levels of West Virginia's government and attract the attention of medical researchers from across the country. The interior of the main house was even more disturbing than the exterior suggested. The rooms were dark, lit only by a few windows covered with decades of grime and by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across walls that appeared not to have been cleaned in years. The floors were covered with a layer of filth, animal droppings mixed with food scraps and other refuse. The furniture consisted of handmade pieces that were falling apart, and the smell inside was so overpowering that Margaret had to step outside several times to catch her breath. But the physical conditions, as appalling as they were, paled in comparison to what Margaret began to understand about the family structure itself. Through careful questioning and observation, she pieced together a genealogy that defied everything she thought she knew about family relationships. Ezekiel Waverly had arrived in the Hollow in 1891 with his wife Martha, seeking isolation from what he described as the corrupting influences of modern society. They had 7 children, 4 sons and 3 daughters. When those children reached adulthood, instead of seeking marriages outside the family, Ezekiel had encouraged or perhaps commanded that they marry each other. Brothers married sisters, cousins married cousins, and the resulting children then continued this pattern into the next generation. By 1964, the Waverly Hollow contained 23 individuals spanning 4 generations, all descended from Ezekiel and Martha, and all products of continuous unions between close relatives. The genetic consequences of this extreme isolation and familial intermarriage were evident in nearly every member of the family. Beyond the obvious physical deformities, Margaret observed cognitive impairments, communication difficulties, and health problems that seemed to affect multiple family members. Sarah, whom Margaret had first encountered, was the daughter of Ezekiel's son Isaac and Isaac's sister Rebecca. The 3 children with Sarah were the result of her union with her own brother Daniel. This pattern repeated throughout the family tree, creating a genetic bottleneck so severe that medical experts, who later studied the case, were astonished that any children had survived to adulthood at all. As the day wore on, Margaret met more family members, each with their own set of physical and cognitive challenges. There was Mary, whose spine curved so severely that she could barely stand upright. There was young Thomas, whose mental development had stopped at approximately a 5-year-old level despite being 16. There was Elizabeth, who suffered from seizures so frequent and severe that she spent most of her days lying on a filthy mattress in one of the outbuildings, unable to participate in family life at all. The family survived through a combination of subsistence farming, though their crops were meager and poorly tended, and through Ezekiel's occasional trips to the nearest town to sell handmade goods and purchase basic supplies. They had no electricity, no running water, and no contact with the outside world beyond these minimal interactions. None of the children had ever attended school. None had ever seen a doctor. None had birth certificates or any official documentation of their existence. As evening approached and Margaret prepared to leave, promising to return with additional resources and support, Ezekiel pulled her aside. His expression had softened slightly, perhaps recognizing that change was inevitable. "You gonna take him away?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet," Margaret answered honestly. "But they need help, Mr. Waverly. They need medical care, education, a chance at a better life." Ezekiel looked back at the house where his family was gathered. "This is all they know," he said. "This hollow, these hills, each other. You take that away, and what do they have left?" It was a question that would haunt Margaret for years to come. As she drove back down the mountain that night, her headlights cutting through the darkness of the Appalachian wilderness, she knew that she had witnessed something extraordinary and terrible, a family that had retreated, so far from society that they had created their own isolated world, with consequences that were written in the twisted bodies and limited minds of its youngest members. The Waverly case was about to explode into public consciousness, raising questions about individual freedom, government intervention, and the hidden costs of extreme isolation. But for Margaret Hensley, exhausted and emotionally drained as she finally reached paved roads again, one thought dominated her mind. How had this been allowed to happen? How had an entire family disappeared into the mountains for 70 years without anyone noticing or caring? Conferis AJR inscrito nes canal, because the stories we uncover here are the ones history tried to bury, and you won't find them anywhere else. To understand how the Waverly family reached such a devastating state by 1964, one must journey back to the origins of their isolation. Ezekiel Waverly was born in 1891 in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. the son of a coal miner who had moved to West Virginia seeking work during the boom years of the late 19th century. Ezekiel grew up in a culture that valued independence, self-reliance, and deep suspicion of outside authority. By the time Ezekiel reached adulthood in the early 1910s, the coal mining industry had transformed the region, bringing with it company towns, labor disputes, and violent conflicts between miners and mine owners. The Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, one of the largest labor uprisings in American history, took place not far from where Ezekiel lived. The violence and chaos of this period profoundly affected Ezekiel, who increasingly saw modern civilization as corrupt and dangerous. In 1918, Ezekiel married Martha Hensley, a young woman from a neighboring county. Martha shared Ezekiel's religious convictions, a strict interpretation of Christianity mixed with older Appalachian beliefs. Sunday, his desire to separate from what they viewed as a degenerating society. After several years of saving money, in 1923 they purchased a remote tract of land deep in the mountains, accessible only by a rough trail that would eventually disappear entirely through neglect. The early years of isolation were difficult but not necessarily unusual for the region. Many Appalachian families lived in remote hollows, maintaining minimal contact with neighbors and towns. Ezekiel and Martha had their first child, Isaac, in 1924, followed by 6 more children over the next 15 years. Rebecca in 1926, Nathaniel in 1928, Ruth in 1930, Daniel in 1932, Leah in 1935, and finally Samuel in 1939. As the children grew, Ezekiel became increasingly radical in his beliefs about isolation. He began to see his family not just as separating from society, but as creating a new, pure lineage untainted by what he called foreign blood. This concept, rooted in extreme religious beliefs and misunderstandings of heredity popular in that era, led Ezekiel to a fateful decision. His children would not marry outsiders. They would marry each other, keeping the Waverly blood pure and ensuring complete independence from the outside world. When Isaac, the eldest son, turned 21 in 1945, Ezekiel arranged his marriage to Rebecca, Isaac's own sister, then 19 years old. This union, which would be illegal and morally condemned in mainstream society, was presented by Ezekiel as a sacred duty to maintain family purity. Whether his children fully understood the implications or were simply conditioned to obey their father's absolute authority remains unclear, but the marriage went forward. The first child of this union, a boy named Jacob, was born in 1946. Initially, he appeared healthy, giving Ezekiel what he saw as confirmation that his strategy was correct. But as Jacob grew, problems became apparent. By age 3, his speech development was significantly delayed. By age 5, his physical growth had slowed. By age 7, he displayed cognitive limitations that would prevent him from ever functioning independently. Despite these warning signs, Ezekiel continued his plan. Nathaniel married Ruth in 1948. Daniel married Leah in 1952. Samuel, the youngest, eventually married his niece, the daughter of Isaac and Rebecca, in 1960, creating an even tighter genetic knot. With each generation, the genetic pool became smaller, the relationships more complex, and the physical and mental consequences more severe. The children born in the 1950s showed increasingly severe problems. Sarah Waverly, born in 1929 to Isaac and Rebecca, exhibited the pronounced facial asymmetry that would characterize many family members. When Sarah married her brother Daniel in 1955, their children displayed an even more disturbing array of conditions: skeletal deformities, cognitive impairments, sensory problems, and immune system weaknesses that left them vulnerable to infections that would be minor in other children but became life-threatening in the Waverly Hollow. By the late 1950s, the family's isolation was nearly complete. Ezekiel's trips to town became less frequent. The children, now adults with children of their own, knew nothing of the outside world beyond the stories their father told them, stories that portrayed society as dangerous and evil, a place where their family would be torn apart and destroyed if discovered. The hollow itself reinforced this isolation. The original house, built in the 1920s, was expanded haphazardly as the family grew, with rooms and outbuildings added without any real planning. The result was a sprawling, chaotic collection of structures that seemed to mirror the family's twisted genealogy. Water came from a spring that often ran dry in summer. Food came from a garden that produced less each year as the soil became depleted and no one had the knowledge to properly maintain it. Chickens and a few goats provided eggs and milk, though disease and poor care meant their numbers fluctuated wildly. Medical knowledge within the family was limited to folk remedies and herbal treatments passed down from Martha before her death in 1956. When children fell ill, which was frequent, they either recovered on their own or they died. At least 7 children born between 1946 and 1963 died before reaching age 5. Their tiny bodies buried in unmarked graves on the hillside above the house. These deaths were never reported, never investigated, simply absorbed into the family's grim reality. The educational situation was equally dire. Ezekiel could read and write, skills he had learned before his retreat into isolation, but he made no systematic effort to teach his children beyond basic biblical literacy. By the second generation, the children born in the 1940s and 1950s, illiteracy was common. By the third generation, some family members could barely communicate beyond grunts and simple gestures. Social dynamics within the family were dominated by Ezekiel's absolute authority. He made all decisions, controlled all resources, and enforced his will through a combination of religious rhetoric and physical intimidation. Martha had been a moderating influence, but after her death, Ezekiel's control became total. The adult children themselves, products of limited cognitive development and lifelong isolation, never questioned his authority or considered alternatives to the life they knew. By 1963, the situation had reached a critical point. The family's genetic health had deteriorated to the point where normal reproduction was becoming difficult. Several women had experienced miscarriages or stillbirths. Children were being born with conditions so severe that they could not survive infancy. The family's physical isolation, once chosen, had become a prison from which escape seemed impossible. It was only through chance that the outside world discovered them. Reverend Crawford's missionary trip through the region in early 1964 was not the result of reports or complaints, so it was simply bad luck for the Waverlys that someone had ventured deep enough into the mountains to find their hollow. Once discovered, however, the machinery of government intervention began to turn, slowly but inexorably. Margaret Hensley's visit on March 17th was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, she returned multiple times, each visit revealing new horrors and new complexities. She brought with her colleagues from the Department of Social Services, public health officials, and eventually law enforcement officers when Ezekiel's resistance became more pronounced. Photographs taken during these visits, stored in government archives and only occasionally released to researchers, show the true extent of the family's condition. Black and white images capture gaunt figures with obvious deformities, children with blank stares and twisted limbs, and living conditions that resembled something from the 19th century rather than the modern 1960s America experiencing economic boom and social transformation. The question that began to dominate discussions among officials was simple but profound. What should be done? The family was suffering, that was clear, but they were also functioning in their own way, surviving according to their own rules in their own isolated world. Did the state have the right or the obligation to intervene? And if intervention was necessary, what form should it take? These debates would continue for months, but even as officials argued, the reality on the ground was becoming untenable. The 1964 winter had been harsh, and the family's food supplies were nearly exhausted. Several members were showing signs of serious illness, and Ezekiel himself, now 73 and showing signs of cognitive decline, was losing his ability to maintain even the minimal order that had kept the family functioning. By late April 1964, the Waverly case had attracted attention far beyond McDowell County. Medical researchers from West Virginia University, having heard rumors of a family exhibiting extreme effects of consanguineous relationships, requested permission to examine the family members. Legal experts from the state attorney general's office began investigating whether criminal charges should be filed against Ezekiel for child endangerment and other offenses. Dr. Robert Mitchell, a geneticist and pediatrician from the university, led the medical team that arrived at the Waverly Hollow on April 28, 1964. With him came 3 other physicians, a nurse, and a medical photographer. What they documented over the next 3 days would become a landmark case study in the effects of extended isolation and family intermarriage, though ethical concerns would prevent most of the material from being published for decades. Dr. Mitchell's examination of the family members revealed a pattern of genetic disorders that was both predictable and heartbreaking. The medical term inbreeding depression describes the reduced biological fitness that occurs when closely related individuals reproduce, and the Waverly family exhibited this phenomenon in its most extreme form. Every single member of the third generation, those born after 1945, showed some degree of physical or cognitive impairment. The skeletal abnormalities were among the most visible effects. Multiple family members exhibited conditions called mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw protrudes significantly beyond the upper jaw, making eating and speaking difficult. Others showed cranial asymmetry, where the skull develops unevenly, often resulting in sensory problems and chronic pain. Several individuals had limbs of unequal length, spinal curvatures, and joint problems that made movement painful and limited. Beyond the skeletal issues, Dr. Mitchell documented numerous organ abnormalities. Heart murmurs were common, indicating structural problems with cardiac valves. Several members showed signs of kidney dysfunction. Vision problems ranged from severe myopia to complete blindness in some individuals. Hearing loss affected nearly half the family members examined. The cognitive assessments were even more disturbing. Of the 12 individuals under age 30 who were tested, none showed mental development beyond what would be expected of a typical 7-year-old child. Some scored even lower, with intellectual functioning comparable to a toddler. The inability to read, write, or perform basic mathematical operations was universal among the younger generations. Dr. Mitchell paid particular attention to Sarah, Waverly, and her 3 children, as they represented the most extreme case of close-line breeding. Sarah was the product of a brother-sister union, and her own children were the result of her relationship with her brother Daniel. The genetic consequences were devastating. Her son Jeremiah, at 21 years old, could not feed himself, control his bodily functions, or communicate beyond primitive sounds. Her daughter Ruth suffered from seizures so severe and frequent that Dr. Mitchell believed she would not survive another year without medical intervention. Young Abel, the youngest at 15, showed signs of an immune deficiency that left him constantly ill with infections that his body could not fight. The medical team collected blood samples and conducted physical examinations, work that was complicated by the family's fear and suspicion of the strangers. Many family members had never been touched by anyone outside the family, never been examined by a doctor, never even looked at their own reflection in a mirror. The experience was traumatic for everyone involved. While the medical investigation proceeded, legal proceedings were moving forward as well. The prosecuting attorney for McDowell County, James Harrison, had been reviewing the case files and consulting with state officials about potential charges. The situation was legally complex. While marriages between siblings were clearly illegal in West Virginia, these marriages had occurred in complete isolation, never registered with any official authority. The family members involved might not even understand that they were violating laws given their complete separation from society. More seriously, questions arose about whether Ezekiel Waverly could be held criminally responsible for the situation. Had he forced these relationships, or had they occurred with the consent of all involved? Could adults who had never been exposed to alternative ways of living be considered to have given informed consent? And what about the children? Had they been harmed through willful neglect, or was this simply a case of extreme poverty and isolation? These legal questions would occupy courts and legal scholars for years. But in the immediate term, Attorney Harrison focused on the one clear priority: protecting the children and most vulnerable family members. On May 10, 1964, he filed a petition in McDowell County Circuit Court, seeking emergency custody of all individuals under age 21 and all adults deemed incapable of independent functioning due to cognitive impairments. The court hearing that followed was unlike anything McDowell County had ever witnessed. Judge Thomas Blackwell, a stern man who had served on the bench for 23 years, presided over proceedings that filled his courtroom with curious onlookers, reporters from newspapers as far away as Charleston, and government officials from various agencies, all claiming jurisdiction over different aspects of the case. Ezekiel Waverly attended the hearing, brought from the Hollow by sheriff's deputies who had been assigned to monitor the family property. He stood before the judge, his weathered face set in defiant lines, and refused to acknowledge the court's authority over his family. "The Lord gave me dominion over my household," he declared, "and no earthly power can take that away." Judge Blackwell listened to testimony from Margaret Hensley, who described in detail the conditions she had witnessed. Dr. Mitchell presented his medical findings, using carefully worded language to describe the genetic consequences of the family's isolation without sensationalizing the situation. Attorney Harrison argued that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent further harm and possibly death. The defense, such as it was, consisted of a court-appointed attorney named David Kelso, who argued that removing family members from the only home they had ever known would cause psychological trauma, and that the family had a right to live according to their own beliefs, however unconventional. It was a weak argument, and Kelso seemed to know it, but he had an obligation to present some defense of Ezekiel's position. On May 18, 1964, Judge Blackwell issued his ruling. He granted the state emergency custody of all family members under age 21 and all adults who, based on Dr. Mitchell's assessment, lacked the cognitive capacity to make independent decisions about their own welfare. This covered 17 of the 23 family members. The remaining 6 adults, including Ezekiel himself, would be allowed to remain in the hollow, but would be subject to regular monitoring by social services. The execution of this court order was perhaps the most traumatic event in the entire Waverly saga. On May 21st, a convoy of vehicles made its way up the mountain to the hollow. Social workers, sheriff's deputies, and medical personnel descended on the property to remove the designated family members. What followed was chaos and heartbreak. Family members who were being taken clung to each other and to those who were staying behind. Some screamed and fought against the deputies despite their physical limitations. Ezekiel stood in the doorway of the main house, shouting curses and biblical verses at the officials. Sarah Waverly collapsed on the ground, wailing as her children were led to waiting vehicles. Young Abel, terrified and confused, had to be physically carried to a van while he reached back toward his grandfather. The scene was documented by newspaper photographers, and the resulting images shocked people across West Virginia and beyond. Here was evidence of extreme poverty and suffering existing in modern America. Hidden in the mountains, invisible to the rest of society until chance revealed it. The removed family members were taken to various facilities. The children were placed in a special unit at a state institution that served individuals with severe developmental disabilities. The adults who were deemed incapable of independent living were sent to similar facilities. The stated goal was to provide medical treatment, education where possible, and a better quality of life. The reality would prove more complicated. Right now, think about this. If you had been one of those officials on May 21st, 1964, watching families torn apart even to save them, would you have had the strength to see it through, or would you have walked away? Drop a comment saying, "I would have stayed," if you believe you could have witnessed that moment and still done what needed to be done. The transition from the isolated Waverly Hollow to institutional life was catastrophic for many family members. Despite the good intentions of social workers and medical staff, the cultural and psychological shock of separation proved overwhelming for individuals who had never known any existence beyond their family compound. The first weeks were the hardest. Sarah Waverly, placed in the women's ward of a state facility near Charleston, refused to eat for 6 days. She rocked constantly in her bed, making a low, keening sound that disturbed other residents and broke the hearts of nurses who tried to comfort her. Her children, separated from her and from each other due to their different care needs, fared no better. Jeremiah developed a pattern of self-harm, banging his head against walls until he had to be restrained. Ruth's seizures increased in frequency, possibly triggered by the stress of her new environment. Abel retreated into near-total silence, sitting motionless for hours, unresponsive to staff attempts at engagement. Dr. Helena Cartwright, a psychologist assigned to work with the Waverly family members, documented what she called profound displacement trauma in her reports. "These individuals are not simply moving from one living situation to another," she wrote in June 1964. "They are being forced to adapt to a completely different reality: indoor plumbing, electricity, regular mealtimes, interaction with strangers, rules and structures they cannot understand. For someone with normal cognitive function, this would be challenging. For individuals with the severe impairments exhibited by the Waverly family, it is overwhelming to the point of being incomprehensible." The medical treatment that the family members desperately needed was equally challenging to administer. Many had never taken any form of medication beyond herbal remedies. The concept of surgery was terrifying to individuals who had never been in a hospital, never seen a doctor, never even taken an aspirin. When doctors attempted to perform necessary procedures, dental work, orthopedic corrections, treatment for chronic infections, sedation was often required simply to allow the patient to be examined. Some medical interventions did help. Better nutrition led to improvements in overall health for many family members. Treatment for parasitic infections and chronic illnesses brought relief from suffering that had been constant in the hollow. Corrective devices like braces and prosthetics helped some individuals move more easily, but the psychological costs of these improvements remained high. Educational efforts met with limited success. Teachers and therapists worked with the younger family members, attempting to teach basic skills like personal hygiene, simple communication, and elementary literacy. Progress was painfully slow. The children who had grown up in the hollow had missed all the critical developmental windows that typically allow children to learn language, social skills, and cognitive frameworks for understanding the world. Catching up was, in most cases, impossible. By the end of 1964, 3 family members had died in state care. An 8-year-old boy named Caleb, son of Nathaniel and Ruth, died of pneumonia that his weakened immune system could not fight despite antibiotics. His death certificate was the first official documentation of his existence. He had never been registered at birth, had no records, had not existed in any legal sense until the moment of his death. 2 months later, Ruth herself died during a particularly severe seizure episode. She was 26 years old. Her death devastated her brother Abel, who had been making slight progress in his new environment but regressed completely after learning of his sister's passing. He stopped speaking again, stopped eating voluntarily, and had to be tube-fed to keep him alive. The third death hit particularly hard because it appeared to be self-inflicted. Mary, the young woman with the severely curved spine, had been placed in a facility that specialized in orthopedic conditions. In December 1964, she was found unresponsive in her room after taking what the subsequent investigation determined to be an intentional overdose of pain medication she had been hoarding from her daily treatments. Whether she fully understood what she was doing or simply wanted to end her constant suffering remained unclear. She was 19 years old. These deaths sparked intense criticism of the state's handling of the Waverly case. Newspaper editorials questioned whether removing the family members had been the right decision. Some argued that the family should have been left alone, that their suffering in institutional care exceeded whatever hardships they had experienced in the Hollow. Others defended the intervention, arguing that the deaths were tragic but that the family's condition and isolation would have led to even more casualties in the long run. Back in the Hollow, life continued for the 6 family members who had been allowed to remain. Ezekiel Waverly, now closely monitored by social services, struggled to maintain the property with so many family members gone. The garden, always marginal, produced almost nothing. The animals died off one by one through neglect. The house fell into even greater disrepair as Ezekiel's age and declining health prevented even basic maintenance. Social workers visited weekly, bringing food and supplies, checking on the remaining residents. These visits were tense affairs. Ezekiel remained hostile, viewing the social workers as invaders who had destroyed his family. The other adults who remained, his sons Nathaniel and Samuel and 2 daughters-in-law, were largely passive, conditioned by decades of absolute submission to Ezekiel's authority and unable to conceive of any alternative to their situation. Margaret Hensley continued to be the primary social worker assigned to the case, despite the emotional toll it took on her. In her personal notes, she wrote about the impossible nature of the situation. "I believed I was saving these people, but perhaps I was only destroying the only world they understood. Every visit to the institutions breaks my heart. Every visit to the Hollow shows me the impossibility of their situation. There are no good answers here, only choices between different kinds of suffering." As 1965 began, a new complication emerged. Several of the younger women in institutional care were discovered to be pregnant. This revelation raised disturbing questions about whether relationships between family members had continued even after removal from the Hollow, or whether something even more troubling had occurred within the supposedly protective environment of state care. Investigations were launched, but given the inability of most family members to communicate clearly about what had happened, definitive answers were hard to establish. The pregnancies were closely monitored by medical staff. Genetic counselors, a relatively new specialty in 1965, were brought in to assess the situation. Given the extreme level of genetic relationship between any potential parents within the family, doctors predicted that the babies would likely exhibit severe abnormalities. Discussions were held about whether the pregnancies should be terminated, but without clear consent from the women involved and given their cognitive limitations. The question of whether they could give informed consent was legally murky. Medical staff felt unable to take that step. The first baby was born in September 1965 to a young woman named Leah, 17 years old and severely cognitively impaired. The father's identity was never definitively established, though it was believed to be another family member who had been placed in the same facility. The infant, a boy, lived for only 3 days. He was born with multiple heart defects, underdeveloped lungs, and severe skeletal abnormalities. His brief life was spent in an incubator, hooked to machines that could not ultimately save him. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery for indigent patients, another Waverly who existed only in the margins of official records. 2 more births followed over the next year with similar tragic outcomes. It became clear that even with separation from the Hollow, the genetic consequences of generations of familial relationships were so severe that normal reproduction had become nearly impossible for family members. The genetic lottery, so thoroughly loaded against them, would not allow a new generation to survive. By 1967, 3 years after the initial discovery of the Waverly family, the situation had stabilized into a grim new normal. 17 family members remained in various state facilities, their conditions monitored, their basic needs met, but their prospects for any meaningful recovery or integration into society essentially zero. The cognitive and physical limitations that resulted from generations of genetic isolation were simply too severe to overcome. In the Hollow, Ezekiel Waverly died on November 3, 1967, at age 76. He was found by a social worker during a routine visit lying in his bed, apparently having passed peacefully in his sleep. His death marked the end of an era and the effective end of the Waverly family as an independent entity. The remaining adults in the Hollow now lacking Ezekiel's dominating presence were unable to maintain even the minimal subsistence the family had managed before. Within 3 months, they too were moved to state care, marking the final dissolution of the Waverly Hollow. The property itself stood abandoned for several years, gradually collapsing back into the wilderness. Local authorities considered burning the structures as health hazards, but ultimately decided to let nature take its course. By the mid-1970s, little remained except overgrown foundations and scattered debris, the Hollow reclaimed by the forest that had hidden the family's secrets for so long. The Waverly case had profound implications that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of one isolated family. Medical researchers, using the blood samples and medical records from 1964 to 1965, published several landmark studies on the effects of consanguinity and genetic isolation. These studies, while careful to protect the family's anonymity, provided concrete data on inbreeding depression in humans, information that had previously been largely theoretical, or derived from historical records rather than direct observation. Dr. Mitchell's research team published a paper in 1969 in a genetics journal that became one of the most cited works on the subject. The study documented the specific genetic markers that had become concentrated in the Waverly family, showing how beneficial mutations were lost and harmful recessive genes were expressed with devastating consistency. The work helped establish protocols for genetic counseling and influence medical thinking about hereditary diseases for decades to come. The psychological and sociological implications were equally significant. Dr. Cartwright's work with the family members demonstrated the critical importance of early childhood development and the impossibility of compensating for developmental windows that had been missed entirely. Her papers on displacement trauma and isolated populations influenced how social services approached other cases of extreme isolation, though thankfully few cases as severe as the Waverlys would ever be encountered again. Legal scholars studied the Waverly case as well, writing articles about the balance between individual liberty and state intervention, about the definition of informed consent when individuals lack the cognitive capacity to understand their choices, and about the obligations of society to individuals who exist outside normal social structures. These discussions influenced child protection laws, mental health regulations, and policies governing state custody of vulnerable adults. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Waverly family was simply the awareness it created. The case, when it became public in 1964, forced Americans to confront the reality that even in the modern world, in their own country, extreme poverty, isolation, and suffering could exist hidden from view. The Appalachian region, long neglected by federal and state governments, received increased attention and resources as a direct result of the publicity surrounding the Waverlys. President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, already underway in 1964, gained additional support as images from the Waverly Hollows circulated in newspapers and magazines. While the family itself received no benefit from this national attention, their situation was already too far gone for broader social programs to help countless other families in similar circumstances of poverty and isolation were reached by outreach programs, healthcare initiatives, and educational opportunities that might not have materialized without the shock of the Waverly revelation. By 1975, all of the original Waverly family members who had been removed from the Hollow had either died or were living in permanent institutional care with no possibility of independent living. The youngest survivors, those who had been children when removed in 1964, were now young adults, but their cognitive and physical limitations meant they would require constant care for the rest of their lives. The oldest survivors, now in their 50s, had spent more than a decade in institutional settings that bore little resemblance to the Hollow, where they had been born but which had become their final home. Sarah Waverly, whose initial encounter with Margaret Hensley had triggered the entire sequence of events, died in 1973 at age 44. Her death certificate listed multiple contributing factors: heart disease, chronic infections, organ failure. But the underlying cause, unstated in the official records, was the accumulated genetic burden of 3 generations of close-line breeding. A body that had been programmed from conception to fail early and painfully. Her son Abel, who had shown the most potential for adaptation in the early days after removal, survived until 1982. He never learned to read or write beyond recognizing his own name. He never understood why he had been taken from his family or what had happened to them. But in his final years, according to staff who cared for him, he seemed at peace. No longer fighting against his circumstances, simply existing in a routine that had become familiar. He was 33 years old when he died. Jeremiah, Sarah's eldest son, outlived his siblings, persisting in institutional care until 1989. By then, he was one of the last surviving members of the Waverly family, a living connection to a tragedy that had occurred 25 years earlier. He died at age 43, having spent more than half his life in state care, never achieving anything close to independence or understanding of the world beyond the narrow confines of his disabilities. The Waverly family line effectively ended with that generation. No children born to Waverly family members after 1964 survived past infancy. The genetic consequences of their isolation had created a biological dead end. A family that could no longer reproduce successfully, that had reached the absolute limits of how closely related humans could breed and still produce viable offspring. Today, the Waverly case is studied in medical schools, sociology departments, and ethics courses as an extreme example of what can happen when isolation, poverty, and genetic concentration combine. The hollow where they lived has been completely reclaimed by nature, accessible only to hikers willing to trek several hours through dense forest, and even then marked by nothing except some barely visible foundation stones and a few rusted remnants of farm equipment. Local historians in McDowell County occasionally mention the Waverly family when discussing the region's past. But there are no monuments, no historical markers, no official recognition of what happened there. It's as if the family's 70 years of isolation have been extended into perpetuity, their story known to scholars and specialists but largely forgotten by the general public. Yet the lessons remain relevant. The Waverly case teaches us about the fragility of the human genome when subjected to extreme isolation and inbreeding. It demonstrates the critical importance of early intervention in cases of child welfare and the limits of what can be achieved when intervention comes too late. It raises profound questions about freedom and autonomy versus social responsibility and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The case also stands as a reminder that even in modern society, even in developed nations with extensive social services and safety nets, people can fall through the cracks, can exist in conditions of extraordinary suffering without anyone noticing or caring until chance brings them to light. The Waverlys were discovered not through any systematic effort to find and help isolated families, but simply because one minister happened to wander into a remote hollow in 1964. How many other families might exist today suffering in isolation, waiting for similar chance discoveries? The Waverly story is ultimately a tragedy without villains, at least not in any simple sense. Ezekiel Waverly was not a monster, though his decisions created monstrous consequences. He was a man who took the Appalachian values of independence and self-reliance to an extreme that destroyed his family. The officials who removed family members from the hollow were trying to help, but their intervention caused its own kind of trauma. The medical professionals who studied the family contributed valuable knowledge to science, but at what cost to the dignity and privacy of vulnerable individuals who could not consent to being studied? These ambiguities and complexities are what make the Waverly case so haunting and so instructive. There are no easy answers, no clear heroes or villains, just human beings making difficult choices in impossible circumstances, and the consequences of those choices echoing across generations. If you've watched this entire investigation into the Waverly family, if you've stayed with their story from that March morning in 1964 through to the final fading of their genetic line, then you understand that some stories need to be told even when they're painful. If you've made it to the end, drop a comment saying, "I watched until the end so I can know who truly engages with these difficult but essential histories." And please hit that like button if the story impacted you. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss future investigations into hidden histories. And share this video with someone who appreciates deep, documented looks at America's forgotten stories. These are the tales that shaped our society, that revealed our failures and our responsibilities, and they deserve to be remembered.